3 bears appeared outside his cabin every winter. When the truth was revealed, his life changed forever. The mountains were silent, wrapped in a thick blanket of snow. Wind howled through the tall pines, rattling loose branches and sending clouds of frost swirling through the air. Walter leaned against the frosted window of his wooden cabin, his breath fogging the glass as he peered out into the storm. That was when he saw them. 3 dark shapes emerged from the white haze, massive, lumbering, and yet deliberate in their steps. Bears. Not just one, but 3 of them. They stopped just beyond the clearing, close enough for Walter to see their heavy coats dusted with snow. The largest one lifted its head, eyes glinting in the moonlight, while the other 2 lingered close beside it. Walter froze, his hand tightening around the wooden frame of the window. He had lived in these mountains for nearly 20 years, and though he'd seen wildlife from a distance, never had bears come this close to his cabin. And why 3? He waited, heart hammering in his chest. But the bears didn't move toward him. They simply stood there, watching silently as though guarding something, or perhaps waiting for something. Minutes passed, but the animals neither attacked nor retreated. Finally, as if obeying some silent signal, they turned back into the forest, vanishing into the snowstorm as quickly as they had come. The next morning, Walter found their paw prints in the fresh snow. 3 sets, circling the cabin but never approaching the door. Almost like they had come to visit, not to threaten. That winter passed with no more unusual sightings, but the image stayed with him. And when the snow returned the next year, so did they. 3 bears, always 3, appearing just outside his cabin in the dead of winter, never crossing the invisible boundary between the forest and his little home. And every year, Walter's curiosity and unease grew stronger. Walter had not always lived alone in the mountains. Once, many years ago, his cabin had been filled with laughter, the crackle of a fireplace, and the warmth of companionship. His late wife, Margaret, had adored the wilderness just as much as he did. Together, they had built this cabin as a retreat, a place to escape the noise of the world. But life has a way of taking what you love most. Margaret had fallen ill, and despite Walter's desperate attempts to save her, the mountains became her final resting place. Since then, silence had been his constant companion. Now, at 63, Walter's days were marked by routine. He chopped wood, fetched water, and mended tools worn thin by years of use. His meals were simple: stews, bread, and the occasional fish caught from the frozen stream nearby. He spoke to no one. Weeks passed without human voices. The only sounds were the creak of the cabin walls against the wind and the lonely cry of ravens overhead. The townsfolk in the valley below often wondered about him. "That old man's gone half wild," some whispered. Children invented stories about the strange hermit who lived alone with the wolves and owls. But Walter didn't care. He found a kind of peace in his solitude, though a gnawing emptiness always lingered in his chest. That was why the bears unsettled him. Their presence broke the monotony of his solitude. They weren't like passing deer or the occasional fox. They came with intention, with purpose. Every winter, right when the snow was heaviest, they returned. 3 sets of eyes glinting in the moonlight, watching silently from the tree-line. Walter told himself they were only curious, maybe drawn by the scent of food or warmth from his cabin. But deep down, he felt there was more. Something about the way they stayed just long enough, year after year, gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. In the silence of those long winter nights, when the cabin seemed too empty and the fire burned too low, he found himself wondering, why me? Why here? The 3rd winter the bears appeared, Walter could no longer ignore them. He stood on his porch one frosty evening, bundled in his heavy coat, watching as the 3 shapes lingered at the edge of the trees. Snowflakes clung to their thick fur, their breaths rising in steaming clouds. They didn't advance, but they didn't leave either. And suddenly, a memory stirred. It had been nearly 15 years ago, a winter even harsher than this one. Walter remembered trudging through the snow with his rifle slung across his shoulder, hunting for firewood when he stumbled upon something unusual. A fallen tree had created a hollow, and inside, huddled together and trembling, were 3 bear cubs. Their mother was nowhere to be found. The cubs' fur was matted with ice, their small bodies shivering so violently Walter thought they wouldn't survive another night. Most men in his place would have walked away, or worse. But something inside Walter softened. He thought of Margaret, how she had once nursed an injured bird back to health, how she always believed that kindness toward animals was kindness toward the soul itself. So he had gathered the cubs in his arms, awkward heavy bundles of fur, and carried them back to his cabin. For days, he fed them scraps of fish and kept them near the warmth of the fire. Their small eyes had watched him with something he could only describe as trust. And when they grew stronger, he led them back into the forest, leaving them near a den where, hopefully, they could survive. He never saw them again. Or so he thought. Now, as he gazed into the snowy woods at the three enormous figures standing side by side, his heart pounded. Could it be? Could these be the same cubs, now grown, returning each winter to the man who had once saved their lives? Walter shook his head, almost laughing at the absurdity. Bears didn't remember things like that. Did they? Yet, deep in his bones, he felt it. The truth hovered just beyond reach, like a memory waiting to be spoken aloud. The winters rolled on, and with each one, the pattern repeated. As soon as the first heavy snow blanketed the valley, Walter would glance toward the treeline, and there they would be. Three shadows in the white, watching, waiting, never straying closer than a few dozen yards from his cabin. At first, Walter tried to dismiss it. Coincidence, he muttered, shoving another log into the fire. But the feeling of being observed never left him. He began leaving scraps of food on the edge of the clearing, fish bones, bits of bread, sometimes even salted meat. By morning, the food would always be gone, and 3 sets of paw prints marked the snow. Over time, Walter grew used to their presence. On lonely evenings, he even found himself speaking aloud to them. Standing on his porch, mug of steaming tea in hand, he would call softly into the wind. "I don't know why you keep coming back, but I suppose I don't mind the company." The bears never replied, of course. But they lingered, silent listeners in the frozen woods. Word spread in the nearby town. Hunters claimed the old man had tamed a family of bears. Children whispered that he was protected by forest spirits disguised as animals. Some folks scoffed, others grew uneasy, but all agreed on one thing: those bears never bothered anyone except to circle Walter's lonely cabin, winter after winter. For Walter, their visits became something more than mystery. They became ritual. When the snow fell, he expected them. He counted on them. He even began to feel less alone, as though some invisible bond tied his life to theirs. And yet, a nagging question always remained: why? What force pulled them back, year after year? The answer, he suspected, lay buried in that long-ago winter when 3 helpless cubs had stared up at him with pleading eyes. He had saved them once. But perhaps in their own way, they had returned to save him too. It was the coldest night of the season. Snow came down in thick sheets, burying the roof of Walter's cabin and muffling every sound. The fire crackled weakly, shadows dancing across the walls as Walter sat in his chair, half dozing. Then, a noise. Not the wind. Not the groan of old wood. This was different. A crunch, deliberate, outside the cabin. Walter's eyes snapped open. He reached for his lantern and rifle, heart pounding. Through the frosted window, he saw movement. But it wasn't the familiar hulking shapes of his 3 winter visitors. These were men. 2 of them, trudging through the snow, rifles slung over their shoulders. Poachers. Walter had seen their kind before, desperate, ruthless, men who didn't care about the laws of the forest. They circled his cabin, their voices muffled but urgent. Old hermits gotta have food stockpiled. Maybe furs. Could fetch a price. Walter's stomach sank. Alone in the dead of winter, he was no match for armed thieves. He gripped his rifle but knew it was useless against 2 younger men. Then came a sound that split the night. A deep, guttural roar. The poachers froze. Another roar followed, this one closer, vibrating through the very walls of the cabin. Walter rushed to the window, eyes wide. Out of the swirling snow emerged the 3 bears, massive and menacing, their fur bristling like soldiers ready for battle. The poachers panicked. "Bears! Run!" one shouted, stumbling back. The other fired a warning shot into the air, but the bears didn't flinch. They advanced, powerful and fearless, driving the men into the woods until their shouts faded into silence. Walter stood frozen in awe, breath fogging the glass. The bears hadn't attacked him. They hadn't touched his cabin. They had protected it, protected him. For the first time in years, Walter felt something stir in his chest. A warmth not from fire, but from belonging. As the 3 giants settled back at the treeline, snow clinging to their coats, he whispered into the empty room. "You came back for me." Morning came, clear and bitterly cold. The storm had passed, leaving the world sparkling under the pale light of dawn. Walter stepped outside, boots crunching in the snow, and looked toward the treeline. They were there. All three. The largest bear stood tall, its breath steaming in the air, while the other two lingered close. Their eyes met his, steady and unafraid. For a long moment, Walter simply stared. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the flood of realization. These weren't ordinary bears. They were his bears, the cubs he had once carried in his arms, the helpless creatures he had saved all those years ago. It seemed impossible, yet the truth was undeniable. Animals might forget many things, but kindness, the kind that means the difference between life and death, was written deep into the soul. And these three had never forgotten. Walter's throat tightened. His cabin had been a prison of silence for so long, his heart heavy with loneliness and grief. But these bears had broken that silence. They had returned every winter year after year, as if to remind him that he wasn't as alone as he believed. And now, they had gone further. They had protected him when no one else could. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered into the cold air, "Margaret, you were right. Kindness always finds its way back." The bears lingered a moment longer, then slowly turned and padded into the forest, their massive forms fading into the white. But Walter knew this wasn't the end. They would be back, next winter, and the winter after that. Not out of hunger, not by chance, but out of something far rarer. Gratitude. From that day forward, Walter was no longer just the lonely hermit in the cabin. He was the man the bears remembered, the one they watched over every winter. And though his life in the mountains remained quiet, it was no longer empty. Because three shadows would always return with the snow, three guardians who had turned his solitude into something extraordinary. And so, in the heart of winter's silence, a lonely man discovered that even the wildest of creatures never forget an act of kindness. This story reminds us that every act of compassion leaves a mark. Even when we think we are forgotten, the kindness we give has a way of returning to us, sometimes in ways more powerful and unexpected than we could ever imagine.